Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Introduction to GENESYS 6.0, presented by Ron Kratzke. My name is Donna Long and I will be your host during today's webinar. Our lead presenter today is Ron Kratzke, Principal Systems Engineer at Vitek. He is a retired United States Navy officer with over 20 years of engineering experience managing nuclear engineering and combat systems on surface ships. Ron was introduced to the systems engineering practice near the end of his naval career while conducting mission and capability analysis for the Navy staff. For the last 16 years, he has worked as a systems engineer, supporting advanced systems development for a number of federal government agencies. He was introduced to CORE in 2007 and utilized CORE to manage system development tasks on 3 different projects in the 5 years before he joined Vitek. He is now a provider of professional services in GENESYS and CORE, as well as a central part of the Vitek training team. Before Ron gets started, I have just a few housekeeping items. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. Please send your questions in as soon as you think of them through the question tab on the webinar control panel. Ron will answer as many questions as he can today, but if we do not get to your question, we will reach out to you after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded. If you experience connection problems during the live presentation, a recording will be made available within 1 business day. The recording will be published to Vitek's webinar archive located on our website. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you would like to see covered in future webinars. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ron. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Donna. As Donna said, or as you've seen in the screens here, we're going to talk about GENESYS 6. GENESYS 6 is our new latest release of GENESYS. It was launched, I think, about 2 weeks ago now. And what I'm going to do is walk through some of the major features and changes that have occurred in GENESYS. So without further ado here, we'll get into this presentation. So I'm going to walk through things in this order. There's some expanded capabilities I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about connected workflows, what we've done with APIs to help people with that, and the Simulink Connector that we've added to GENESYS 6. I'll talk about some of the other refinements that we have in the model, and then I'll finally close it up by talking about how to move your what the big changes are in the schema and how to migrate your projects into GENESYS 6 from an earlier version of GENESYS. On the right-hand side here is a copy of the cover sheet for the new features guide. There's more detailed explanation on all these features in the new features guide, and you can find that in the documentation, and it's called the new features.pdf when you look at that. So expanded capabilities. The overarching thrust here for us in GENESYS 6 is looking at how you do things, how you do engineering systems, and helping to support the engineer in doing that. So we have an added feature that talks about searching in the project or searching through the project. You have different ways to search now. We have some enhanced model management and configuration control features in GENESYS 6. I'll talk a little bit about report writing and some of the support we've added into GENESYS 6 on report writing, and I'll talk a little bit about how we've changed the block diagrams through service pack releases in GENESYS 5 and including what we have in GENESYS 6. So let's talk about searching first. For searching in a project, we've added a search button on the home page to allow you to search. And when you search, you can search for a particular name. You could look at name and description only to do your search, or you can search all attributes. And when you do that search, then you'll end up with you'll end up doing the search by selecting either the project in the Explorer or a particular folder. And when you do the search results are stored in the model so you can go back and look at those again. And once you actually have the results stored, you can actually see them in the model by clicking on the search results, and then you'll actually see the items that are in there. So what I'm going to do here is, and I'm going to flip back and forth a couple times here between the slides and Genesys so you can actually see how these things work in Genesys. So let me just leave this screen a second. And right now, what I have up now is I have Genesys here, and I'm actually in the sample geospatial library. And so what I'm going to do is I'll switch here just to bring this into systems engineering. Look at the systems engineering mode here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the project, and I'm going to search here on all attributes, and I'm going to put the search text. I'm going to look for the term service in the model. And I'm not going to worry about matching the case or matching the whole word. I'm just going to take that word service, and I'm going to look at it, and it's going to do a search. And what you see now is in the project pane over here, you see the results of this project search. And because I have the search down here, okay, I then get a list of all the elements or entities, regardless of what class they're in, where that term I looked at, called the term service, is located. And if I look at one of these now, if I look at that, like I'm looking at the concern 3 here, it gives me the attributes because I searched for everything, for all attributes, and it shows me where that term service shows up. In the alternatives attribute, it shows up here. In the decision attribute, it shows up in the decision. Okay, and we can look at, you can search here, this term self-assessment, it's only showing up here in the description, for example. If I look at the make in-person requests, it's showing up just in that description, okay? And I can go back, the actual slide showed a couple of different ones. I'll go back and look at, do I have anything that says library? So I'm going to look through the whole model, and I'm going to do a search again, and I'm going to look at the search text library here, just to show that again. And here you'll see the search, it goes through and does the search here. And again, down here, you'll see every place that I have the term library. I mean, we would think that it's going to be in a lot of things because I have this thing called the geospatial library, so I probably use that term in many places in the model. But, and again, when I click on any particular element, it'll tell me where that term comes up. And so those are kept there for the instance of the particular search that we did. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the presentation here, and you see how this is exactly the one I actually picked. I actually picked concern 3 and showed that that these items showed up. Okay, so you can search, you can select the search, select the element in the browser pane, and then you'll end up seeing the results of that search and what those elements are, what those entities are. Now, in model management, we've added the ability to lock entities, okay? My statement out over on the on the left-hand side is a little bit misleading. You don't lock a folder, but you can lock all the entities within a particular folder. So the way this works is, in order to do this, you have to have administrative privileges in order to lock entities, excuse me. So what you can do is when you select something for locking and it's locked, what you will have is you'll have the little lock symbol on the name in the property sheet. Okay, in this case, I selected geospatial library and I locked the geospatial library. Locking the entity locks the attributes and the parameters. So everything that's in the attribute sheet is locked, and so are the parameters that you've defined for the particular entity. And then any of the systems definition relationships are locked. And what we've done is in the schema, we went through and we added a systems definition property to a relationship. And what that is it's a systems definition relationship that's part of the fundamental design. And so when we lock the element, we're going to lock those those relationships that are ID'd as systems definition relationships. So what you need to do is you select the entity and do the locking. When you're selecting a particular folder to lock, you're going to see a warning come up that says, "Are you sure you want to lock every entity within the folder?" And if you click OK, then you will get the lock. So what I'll do here in a moment is we'll switch back to the model and we'll walk through how to do this. One more slide here for a moment is, the next slide we'll talk about report writing. So we're gonna leave the slides for a moment, and we're gonna go into the model again. And so let's look at first, how would I lock a particular element? So if I just wanted to lock this thing called availability, if I said I'm good with that, I'm good with all the information here, all the attributes are fine, and all the relationships are appropriate for this requirement, I can hit lock. And when I do that, because I'm the administrator, it'll show up with the lock symbol. So now that it's locked, you'll see that I can't go in here. I can't edit any of these attributes, and I cannot make some of those. I cannot make the system definition relationship. So if I want to say it's refined by a new requirement, let's say it's refined by, I'll add, and when I try to do that, it says it's locked because this element here is locked, and the refined by relationship is a systems definition relationship. So the question is, how do I know which are the systems definition relationships? There's two ways to find that out. One way is to go into the schema and look at the relationships. So I'm going to go down here to schema for a moment, and I'm going to navigate to the relations, and I'll look at that relationship refines by. And you'll see way over here in the corner the fact that the refines is not only an essential relationship, I mean it's fundamental to the basic model, but we've determined that to be a systems definition relationship. And so when you lock it, what that means is, again, when you lock that element, that relationship is going to lock also. Now you can change this by going into schema mode, and you can unselect the systems definition if you want. And that would be something you would do as an administrator if that's what you wanted to do. Fundamentally, this gives us the ability to actually lock things as we go to review them, and we look at, we're done with these particular elements, we can review it. Unlocking is pretty simple. I just go back, hit the unlock button, and it's unlocked. So just to demonstrate here, if I'm looking at a folder, again, if I wanted to take all of these requirements that are within this folder, use case derived, if I select the folder, I can hit the lock button. And again, it says, do you want to lock every entity in that folder? Say yes. And what happens is now you'll see that each of these are locked. It's not that the folder is locked. I can add an element to this folder. I can add a new entity to the folder. The folder's not locked, but this new entity is not locked. What I did was, with the original set of entities, I locked those, and then I can add more to this if I want. I'm just going to go in here, and I'm going to remove this now. So all of these are locked. Do I want to unlock everything in this folder? I can say yes, okay. And that'll return them to the unlock status. So this is a way to keep us, to give us the ability to put some configuration control on the model. I can also lock or unlock a package as well. I haven't done that here, but it's simply just adding a package and then adding elements to that package, and then I could just take and lock that package. Okay. So now let's look at another part here is the report writer. So I won't go into I won't go into detail actually writing a report in this webinar, except to let you know that we have a document now called Introduction to Writing Reports. So in this document, we walk you through the fundamentals of what the banded report writer structure is, how that report writer structure is put together, and we walk through actually going in and getting a series of entities out of the model by navigating to a particular class and pulling those entities out. We show you how to sort the entities and how to filter those entities, and then how to get a printout of those entities. And then we talk about how to go from one set of entities to another. In other words, if I wanted to look at a number of concerns, or if I wanted to have a number of requirements that have concerns, I can walk through and do that. And then we also talk about how to add a hierarchy diagram into that printout. So that gives you the fundamentals of how to do a quick little report. It'll give you the ability to use the couple of reports that are in there that are actually in Genesys, and you can modify those to change the different classes and change the different reporting structure. We also offer now a 2-day report writing class in Genesys, and that goes into many more features of the report writer, and a lot of the advanced features is how to styling and how to put different sections together of a document, and how to wrap up a multi-level search of the project, and you can actually get to the point after the Genesys 6.0 class of actually assembling your own sort of tailored specification report or tailored multi-section report out of Genesys. Again, look at this introduction to report writing, introduction to writing reports. It's in the documentation. It'll walk you through exactly how to handle some basic reports, and from there, I think it'll really help you launch off into other reports. In Genesys, quickly, if you go down into reports in Genesys, you'll see some of the basic reports in there. Now, my model here is going to have several other reports, but we have a number of the basic reports in there. Genesys is just going through, pulling up the reports, the entire report library for me. And you'll see some basic reports here. And you can pull in, you can look at these reports after you've gone through the report writer and actually know how these reports are put together. Back into our model here. The next thing that we had as far as helping in model management is block diagrams. So we went through a series of service pack changes and upgrades in Genesys 5 to actually add some additional controls on how the lines are routed and how lines are put in the connection between the boxes. So lines and labels don't automatically redraw for minor changes in the diagram's block size or location anymore. So when you put blocks on a diagram, in this case, when I put like the workstation block in here, and I put like the command center block on this diagram, the diagram will automatically put the routing lines in there. The best way to handle these diagrams now is to place the blocks in and size the blocks in the diagram first, and then go through and modify the routing of all the connections. Okay, so do the block placement first, and then do the line management. And if you have to do some minor alteration of the blocks, you will not have the lines move around dramatically any longer. And that feature, the features in the service packs in Genesis 5 have been moved over to Genesis 6. So now we get into some more complicated, if you will, or more complex things that we've added in the model. Again, we're really focusing in Genesis 6 on how do you, as a systems engineer, how do you do better engineering of the system? What we want to do here is connect, if you will, what I call the descriptive architecture, which is what's in Genesis, with the analytical architecture. Remember in Genesis 5, we came out with the constraint and parametric diagrams, and we came out with a connector that allowed us to move between, allowed us to move from the constraints and parametric diagrams and use the MATLAB connector to solve those equations. What we've done in Genesis 6 now is we've added an initial capability for the Simulink connector. And then we've also provided the ability to create custom connectors, and we've written a document on how to do an API connector. And then I'll talk about how we enhanced our existing connectors through Excel and PowerPoint and such. So let me dig into this a little bit more. So again, we took the connectors in Genesis 5 where we had to the MATLAB, and we've put into Genesis 6 the ability to do this, to connect the detailed design in Simulink with the design in Genesis. So when you're doing your design, many times you'll get to a subsystem and you'll have some understanding of how that subsystem is going to work. This is a typical hydraulic subsystem in an overall, higher level design. And I've said that in my subsystem, in my hydraulic subsystem, I'm going to have a pump, and I'm going to have a four-way directional valve. I have to have some sort of reservoir that's going to hold the hydraulic fluid, and I'm going to operate some hydraulically operated ramps. Okay, I understand this in my design, and I may have done some, likely have done some constrained parametric modeling, and I have some big ideas of, if you will, or some top-level designs of these are the parameters that are involved in the system. But I'm now ready to progress down to the detailed level design. I want to know more about the individual characteristics of a pump, or I may have a particular pump in mind. I may have done some detailed design in Simulink, and I know that this is the variety of pump I want to use. These are the variety of four-way valves I want to use. This is the type of hydraulically operated ram I want to use. Many times in industry, you're working with suppliers that have these individual blocks in their catalog in Simulink, and you want to look at putting those into your design and making sure that the system will work. And you're doing that in Simulink. So what we want to do is be able to move this high-level interface diagram and connect it with the Simulink diagram, or the detailed design in Simulink. So this initial capability, and I keep saying initial capability here because this capability is going to grow over time. So this is our initial workflow going from the descriptive model to the detailed design. And so we have an IFBD here. And what happens is I have the IFBD, and I don't have the physical links yet identified for those blocks. I don't know, I may know what I want to take across the physical link, but I haven't made all those connections yet because I want to look at that in the detailed design. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those blocks that I have in Genesis, and I'm going to map them to blocks in Simulink and come up with a Simulink diagram that's unconnected. And I'm going to actually show you in a moment how we do two things here. First, we associate the blocks on the IFBD with elements in Simulink, and then we export that entire model into Simulink, where I can then manipulate the model and actually do the detailed design in Simulink. Eventually then in Simulink, I have a model here that works, and I've got a whole series of parameters because I've selected an individual pump with many more parameters than I ever thought of in that descriptive design. I may have thought about, you know, how much fluid I wanted to put out, how much the pressure is and all that stuff. But now, once I've selected that hydraulic pump, I have many more details in there, like how big are the orifices in the pump, how much, what's the flow rate, what's the thermal heat that that pump develops. Those sorts of detailed design elements that I have to include or push back into my detailed model. And once into my descriptive model, excuse me. So now I have this detailed model. I can then take that detailed model and I can work on and I can then take the information from there and I can push that information back into Genesys to get the detailed Genesys model. So here, this final model in Genesys, which is the one that's over here, actually shows the ports and the connections here, and it mirrors, if you will, the model that you have in Simulink. So again, this is an initial solution that we've developed. In future service packs through Genesys 6, and eventually when we actually do another upgrade to Genesys to make Genesys 7, whenever that occurs in the future, we will work on how do I maintain these? If I make a change in the Simulink model, how does that get reflected as a possible change that needs to be reflected back in the Genesys model? So again, this is an initial workflow, and we recognize there are things we want to do here. And what we're really looking for is people that are out there working on this, using this workflow, providing us some input as to what things you want to see. So we're working with a couple of companies right now on how to advance this further, and we're hoping to get this out so people can use it in our user community and see where else we need to go. So this is a nice, great high-level description of what we're doing. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through how to do this. So the first thing we need to do is we need to extend the model with a Simulink extension. And what that extension does is, the Simulink extension is just like any other extension that you would add to a particular model. Is the first thing it does is it adds this attribute here called Simulink block type. And what's going to happen here is when we make the association between Genesys and Simulink, it's going to populate this attribute with the library element in Simulink that this is associated with. And what the other thing the extension does is it allows us to take this IBD that we have here, either an IBD or a physical block diagram, and I can select a block on here, and I can set the block type using this button on the ribbon bar. So what happens here is I'm going to take the physical block or the flow internal block diagram, and I can take the component definition of the descriptive model and link it to an object in the Simulink model. I can get the connecting ports in the Simulink model, and I can actually pull back the specific parameters that the Simulink model has associated with it. So what happens is I have to go through this, grab the hydraulic pump, and actually go through. When I set the block type, what happens is the Simulink connector, the Simulink extension here, reads the Simulink library, and you have to pull in the libraries you're going to use. There's a tremendous number of libraries with Simulink, but not all of them may be used in this particular design. And when I figure out all of the things that I want to pull in, I'm going to pull back in the particular elements, and I'm going to make that association. So in this case, I'm showing the hydraulic pump being associated with something called the fixed displacement pump in Simulink, and it's within the hydraulics part of pumps and motors. And when I do that, then I'm going to end up with every element. Page up a second. Every element then on the IBD ends up being associated with a particular entity or a particular block in Simulink. So then what I need to do is I want to export that entire diagram, that hydraulic subsystem diagram, to Simulink. And what happens is when I do that export, I actually create a hydraulic subsystem in Simulink, and I have those individual blocks in there. Then now that I have this in Simulink, I can go into Simulink and I can make the connections as appropriate. I can do whatever detailed modeling I need to do, validate that this system will work using the detailed parameters that I set up in Simulink and the detailed functioning. And then when I get all done, then what I need to do is go back and I can create, I can then pull in, I can create in GENESYS the actual links and the actual ports that have been defined over here in Simulink. I can then define them here in GENESYS. Okay. There is a bit of a process here to this, a little bit of a workflow that you have to work through. It takes a little bit of time to do it. I'll just show you some of the key parts in GENESYS. I really don't have time to walk through the entire workflow here to do that, but I just want to show you how this works a little bit in GENESYS. So I got to go here and get into GENESYS. So to do this here, I'm going to go back here to back to home. I'm going to open up the model here. So what I have here is, just for demonstration, I have a hydraulic system example where I haven't started to populate the Simulink model, and I have one that has the Simulink model populated in it. So I'm going to open this one here, the final one, just to show you how this looks once you do the importing of the elements. So here's this final model, and here is I'm going to go to the components here, and you'll see this is the hydraulic subsystem here, and you'll see that I have a this is the interface block diagram that we had in the actual presentation, and once that comes up, then I'll show you so this is basically the diagram I had in the presentation. Okay, so this is the interface block diagram, and if I switch here and go to the flow internal block diagram here for a moment. So this is the flow internal block diagram. I don't have the connections here because what I wanted to show you here is that is if I look at this hydraulic reservoir, and I'm going to look at the property page for the hydraulic reservoir as an example, and you can see here where it's got the link here to the actual, this is the link to the actual element in Simulink that I'm actually mapping this to. So I'm mapping this element to this reservoir parents TL in Simulink, okay? And then when I do that, I end up with a series of parameters that are associated with that element in Simulink. So here's a bunch of parameters that this particular reservoir has, and we can, if we were in Simulink, we can specify those and pull those and work on pulling those back in. So what does this look like in Simulink? So let me go over here. So here's the model. Well, let me back up a second here. So I create those connections, and then what I would end up doing is go back to this one here. If I had this flow internal block diagram here, now I can take this. If I go to my project here, you'll see the Simulink exporter button here. So once I've created all these associations here, then I can take that model, and what I'm doing is I'm going to take this particular subsystem and I would push that into Simulink. Okay, so you have to have Simulink running on this computer where I'm doing this, obviously. So this is the way I've created this. I'm going to keep this in my MATLAB folder, and I'm not going to finish this because if I do, I'll overwrite what I have already in Simulink. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull over the model that I have in Simulink here so you can see it. And what I've done here is if I was working on Simulink, I have these elements here, and I could actually in Simulink then work on how am I going to make the connections here and how am I going to actually simulate this. Again, simulating it in Simulink and setting it up for that Simulink, that detailed design, a little bit beyond the scope of this, and I'm not a Simulink expert here, but you get the feeling for how to put all this together and actually have the mechanical engineer would actually do the detailed design here and figure out how all the things that he wanted. And then eventually when I come back here, then I can take these individual links here and I would create those links. Cancel. I can create those links in the model here that I have in the IBD. So I'm not going to go in greater detail here. I just want to show you one other thing here. If I go to this, just go to the hydraulic reservoir here. I want to show you one more thing before I leave here, and that's the mechanics of actually making that particular making the particular association. So if I have this flow internal block diagram again, when I make the association here, when you do this, it has to confirm you have a MATLAB installation, and you're going to end up with a series of libraries here. And one of the things you need to do when you set this up is to actually load the correct libraries. I talked about that a moment ago, but a few steps here in making the whole thing work. And it'll load the libraries that I've designated for this particular project. And it just takes a second here for these to load up. So what it's doing is it's actually looking into Simulink and pulling in all the libraries that I've associated with this particular model. I thought I had it already loaded in background, but I guess it was, I had closed it when I was working on. And now it's bringing in the fluids library, and then it's going to bring in one more library, which are the three libraries I needed to actually do this work. Now the reason it's doing this again is because I had shut down and actually restarted my computer. Once you get this running on an instance of Genesys, it's very easy to move back and forth between this, but loading the data the first time takes a little bit of effort. And so then now that I have these in here, I can pull up different things out of these, and I actually have the individual blocks here that I can now pull in. So if I needed to add a particular pipe that I wanted, I could add that, and it adds all that information. And again, I'm associating the particular entity with this one right here. So that pretty much summarizes how that design works, or how our connector works right now. Let me go now into the next section here. So one of the things that we also added in Genesys, another thing we added in Genesys 6 is the ability to, we've always had this ability. What we did is we added some more documentation to help you get started with writing APIs. So we now have this getting started with the Genesys API. This guide is very detailed. It gives you a lot of code and a lot of things to help you get started with an API. This API, actually, you can run it from Visio, and you can see, or not Visio, excuse me, in Visual Studio, and you can actually see how that API works. The API document talks about how to log into Genesys, how to navigate the model, gives you the code for how to read entities, how to create entities when you're pushing stuff back in, how to modify entities, and how to log out of Genesys. Those are the basic building blocks behind any API that you would want to create. There's other resources that we have out there. If you're a customer, you can go to the Vitech website, go into My Support. There's 2 other webinars that are in there. One's a basic one on actually creating the API code. Another one's an advanced one on how to do an advanced API. Those were done by Andy Dotson earlier this year, but you can see those resources after you get done reading reading the actual book. So what happens here is in Visual Studio, you can actually open Visual Studio. You can go in and navigate into our API samples folder, which is right here, and you can pull up this API sample solution. What that does is it brings in all of these sample APIs that we have. And once you do this, then if you select the requirement commenter, and the requirement commenter is the API that's discussed in detail in that API document. And you can click on it, and then you go debug and start a new instance of it, and you'll run that requirements commenter. And you can actually see, you know, if you're in Visual Studio, you can actually pull up the code that's actually being executed, and you can see how that code works through. But what happens is the first thing that comes up is this login dialog box on the left-hand side. So we have this login dialog box that comes up, and you can log in. In this case, I logged in as the administrator. And what happens then is you get to this next dialog box. Excuse me. This next dialog box here, and you can actually select the project. You've logged into GENESYS. It's very similar to if you have the Excel connector and you're using the Excel ribbon bar. You're going to log in. You can select your project. This is a requirements commenter, so it looks at the requirements, gives you the requirement description, and then allows you to add a note on a requirement. Now, a note is a new class that we've added to GENESYS. That new class, called a note, allows us to write an informal, if you will, comment to anything to any class or entity in the architecture, okay? And when the note's created, then when you're all done and you click and you close out of the API, you're going to have that note written into the database, and you'll never have had to open GENESYS. You could be clueless to how GENESYS is put together. Someone just said, hey, go in and look at the requirements and provide me comments. And all I got to do as the administrator then is give the person a login and tell them, here, run this application, run this API. It'll allow you to look through the requirements and add a note on those requirements. And the thought is here that we put this together for requirements. If you just change the class, you could change this page and recreate another commenter for components or interfaces or links or whatever it is you want. Okay. So I'm just going to escape out of this real quick here, and I'm going to open up Visual Studio. And what you'll see here is I have Visual Studio here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to do this real quick because I'm kind of running short on time here. But I'm going to navigate to API samples. I'm going to grab this. I'm going to open it. Okay. Now, if you're a software developer, you're very familiar with all the screens you're going to show up here, but you can actually look at the code and you can see the output and how things work. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the requirements commenter here. I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to go to debug, and I'm going to start a new instance. Okay. And so here's the actual page that comes up, the login. So I'm going to go add administrator, admin. It's going to pop me up, and it's going to say, well, remember my project model had 3 or 4 in there. I'm going to go to this library. Perform self-assessment was a place I was, and here I'm just going to say, I'm going to add. And when I add, it's going to come up with another dialog box that says, I'm just going to leave that as note 1, and I'm going to say, this is my comment on this requirement. And say, okay. And I could add, another one, or I could go to a different requirement and walk through a different requirement, go to the next requirement. Okay, add another one. And I'm just going to say done here just to close this out. And now that it's done, I'm just going to hide Visual Studio here for a moment. And now I will go back to the geospatial library. That's the project I was working in. And you'll see here in the geospatial library, if I go to Systems Engineering Facility, you will now see a note here. And this is the note I added on this particular entity. So this is a comment on this particular requirement. I mean, obviously, I would have much more substantive description here. I can then take this. So if I had a stakeholder review my model, he could go through and put all these comments in here. I could look at it. They're all open. I could accept some, put them under review. I could change the way I'm looking at them. I can. These are all of type comment, and I could make a decision in here. And the decision might be that this note then can identifies a change request or a concern or a risk, and then from there I could then end up going into the way I would normally, the way we normally teach to actually do a change to the model. So that's the note class. That's one of our big changes to the schema. I'll cover that also. I just have a slide on that in a moment here about schema changes. So again, this API allows us to write comments on requirements. It uses the new class called notes. Finally, a couple other little things just to enhance the other connectors that we have. We've improved the performance of the XL connector. We did that in an earlier service pack in Genesis 5, but the XL connector is now much quicker at connecting and pulling information into and out of an Excel spreadsheet. And we've added progress indicators so you can actually see what's happening, or you can actually track the progress when you're using those two connectors. So just I'm going to close up here with a couple of real quick things on deployment and auto select and a couple of other things. If you're deploying in Genesis 6 now, you don't have to install a separate copy of the SQL Server Express, and it just makes it easier for you to make that deployment when you're working through it. This is discussed in more detail in the actual change guide. So go back to that and read through that. A big point here is customer can help. Customer support is a great help here in helping you to decide what's the best installation for your configuration. Okay, auto select and dialog box. So the dialog box is set so that the last location or folder that you use, it'll go back to that. So when you're doing multiple things like multiple drag and drops, it's going to go back to the last place you went to. You don't have to continue to keep navigating to that place. And just a little advertisement here. In Genesis 6, we now have a University Edition. So if you're interested, if you're one of the instructors out there listening to this, or you're in the classroom and you're wondering if your instructor would ever use Genesis, we do have a University Edition now. universityprogram@vitechcorp.com. Send an email to that email address, and the customer support guys will talk to you about how to set up a university program. So schema changes, we talked about these before in that I demonstrated how we use the notes. So the schema changes are in there, they're documented in there. The note has been added to the Systems Engineering Facility, and the note can comment on essentially just about anything in the architecture, and then it will identify it can identify a risk, a concern, or a change request. We also cleaned up a few other relationships and relationship targets in the schema. And the last thing is a word about navigating from earlier versions. You can set up or install your Genesis 6, and then you can open up the project that you've had in Genesis 5. However, you won't have the benefit of the schema changes, particularly the note class, unless you migrate your schema from 5 to 6. Many people forget about doing this. They open it up and say, hey, everything works, and then they can't find something that they were looking for. You have to take your project and go through the migrate schema, and that's under the project ribbon bar, and the button up here is highlighted. So go through and migrate your project, bring your project up to Genesis 6. If you have any questions or concerns about that, customer support can help you walk through that. So Donna, I'm going to stop there. I think I've left a few moments for questions and answers. I've left a few moments for questions, and hopefully I have the right answers. So I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you, Ron. We do have a few questions thanks to our participants. I encourage you to join the discussion now and submit your questions using your webinar control panel. If you do need to leave the webinar, please take a moment before you go to respond to the quick survey that will pop up on your screen. Our first question comes from Paul, and he asks, how do you transition licenses from core to Genesis, and are there any costs involved?
If you have, and Donna, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, if you have a core license and you're up to speed on maintenance, you're up to your current on maintenance, then you can take a core license and move it over to a Genesis license. And when you take a core project, you can take that core project and import it into Genesis. And then you can modify that project in Genesis, but you can't take it back to core. So make sure you've got you're fine with making that transition. And there's a little program that we go through to help you do that. It's not like we remove the core license one day and we give you the Genesis license, and the very next day we remove the core license from you. So you have a little bit of time to do that transition. Do you want to add anything to that process,
No,
Donna?
you got it. You got that. And the only thing I'll add is if anybody is thinking about moving from core to Genesis, we do handle that through a phone conversation so that we can talk about the differences because there are differences between the two products. If you're interested.
I'll offer that. Not only customer support will do that, but if you need some professional services help about how I would do things, then we can talk about that too. We can do a little one-on-one with you guys. So
right. Okay, so let's move on to our next question. Our question comes from Emily. How do I find out if a relation is considered part of the system definition?
Well, I kind of showed that a little bit earlier, but let me just review that. So if I'm in the model here, if I go to the schema down here, I'm down here in this part of the model. So if I open schema, I can open the relations, and any relationship that has, I can then select the relation, and I will see over here systems definition is checked. There's a list of about there's about 8 or 9 that are not systems definition related. For example, a common one would be reports and reports on, because that's just using documentation. It has nothing to do with the system design, so it doesn't have systems definition here. So once I've locked, and it kind of makes sense, once I've locked that entity, I still would want to be able to report on that entity in many different places in documentation. So I leave that reports on, reported by as a non-systems definition one.
Okay. A follow-up question is, how do I change the system definition?
Right. So what you need to do is you need to go into a schema mode, and you do that by going here to the schema tab and just edit the schema. I won't do that right now, but you edit the schema, and then once you're in there, if you're on this relationship, you can just uncheck that and uncheck whichever ones you want, and then you can end schema editing, and those would be unchecked. We just set them up that way. It's not something you can't. You can go in and change it in the schema mode. Edit the schema.
Okay. Let's see. Is there a mechanism? This is from Bill. Is there a mechanism to submit a change proposal for a locked object?
Right. So if you had a change request package, that change request package, I'll just add one here. The change request package would impacts impacts an element, and impacts is not a locked system definition one. So I can take that change request. I could say that it impacts a locked element. Now, I could also say that the change request, after I've looked at it, results in a new requirement, right, or a function, requirement or a function, and that wouldn't be locked, so I could create that new one. Does that make sense? So it doesn't prohibit me, if an entity is locked, it doesn't prohibit me from making a change request, because that impacts relationship is what tells me that I have that element and I want to make a change, so I can, it's impacted by a change request package. And once I approve that change request package, then I can go in and unlock that entity and change it, or unlock that entity and make a new refined by relationship to clarify. Maybe the request was to break it up into two individual requirements or allocate it differently or whatever.
Okay.
So I think I've answered that.
Yeah, I think you did. Okay, our next question is, say that you have used the lock folder command. Can you move entities into that folder?
Yes. So here, remember, I'm not locking the folder, I'm just locking the elements that are in there. So if I take this and I want to, and I'm just using a different method here, I just right-clicked and said lock. Do I want to lock everything? Okay. So each of these elements here, these entities are locked. But I could take an element out of the parent folder and move it into that. Okay, but when I do, that particular entity is not locked, because what I'd have to do is go back and relock the entire folder.
Okay. Let's see, we've got a few more questions. In a multi-user environment, how do you know who locked an entity? And I'm not sure you do, to be honest with you, because it's not in the audit log. It does not change.
Yep, it's not in the audit log, so it doesn't change there. That would have been my first guess. I don't think you really can know. However, again, it's got to be an administrator. So how many people do you have that have the administrator access?
Yes.
Would
okay. Yes. But a good, thought for the future. We may consider adding something there. Can you, this is from Avat, can you undo a delete in GENESYS?
Once you delete an entity?
Mm-hmm.
I think you can you?
You can do an undo.
Yeah.
There is undo, redo on many commands. It does not work on diagrams, but it does work in text and in elements and entities. Okay, another question from Avat. Go ahead. Let me show the undo there.
There you go.
It comes back. Another question from Avat is, can GENESYS generate reports in Word format?
Yes. So the reports that come out, you have the option of creating the report in Word. I don't know if I'm trying to think of an easy report to run here. Well, I won't go through and run the report. It's going to take a bit to run the report, but yes, you can save it.
Short on time.
Yeah, we're running short on time. You save it as an RTF format. Yes.
Okay. A last question from Mark. If you have an existing model in Simulink, can you import it into GENESYS rather than starting in GENESYS?
We don't have the ability to import a Simulink model into GENESYS right now. What I demonstrated is our initial exporter from GENESYS into Simulink. We will be building additional capability on this as we go along. But what I would say is the easiest thing to do is go back to my slides here. There's not a one-button build. However, if I have this thing built in Simulink, I can leave this open and I can actually build this model. I could actually build the hydraulic pump here and all these manually right now, and then I can associate those and then have all those parameters get pulled in. So it's not a one-button operation right now, but you can facilitate that.
Okay. Thanks, Ron. That's going to wrap up our Q&A for today's presentation. If we did not get to your question, we will reach out to you after the webinar. If you have any other comments or questions for Ron, please don't hesitate to send him an email, or you can post your questions on LinkedIn grouped page. Just visit linkedin.com and search for Vitech Corporation. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We will be taking a break on webinars for a little while, I believe, but you can check our webinar page for the next webinar that will be coming up in the future. Remember that at the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. Once again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.